In order to demonstrate CodeIgniter, I'll be creating a simple dynamic web page. If you haven't read the introductory section of the user guide, I encourage you to go ahead and do so. In particular, you should read the section that discusses the model, view, controller approach to application design, since CodeIgniter is based on that approach. When you install the system, you'll have a directory structure that looks like this. I'd like to focus on the application folder, as this is where you'll be working most of the time as you build your own applications. You'll be building controllers. These are your PHP classes that are designed to take an incoming HTTP request and process it in some way. You'll be building view files. These will be your HTML web pages, or they can be page fragments like headers, footers, or sidebars. You'll also notice an errors folder here. This folder contains a couple templates that allow us to display various error types. For instance, if I were to load the index.php front controller, you'll see we're getting a 404 page, which happens to correspond to this template here. There are a number of ways you can add your own classes if you want, and you can also optionally create models to represent your data structures and interact with your database. Today, I'll focus on controllers and views because any application you develop with CodeIgniter is going to minimally contain those two resources. So let's build a controller. When you name your file, it must be the same name as the class of the controller with a PHP extension. I'll call this one blog so I can use it in the next tutorial. A controller is simply a PHP class, and one thing that you need to remember when you name your controller is that it needs to be capitalized. Remember that the class and the file name must match, but the class name will be capitalized and the file name will not. The second thing is that it must extend the parent controller class, the system controller. By extending the main controller class, you allow your local class to inherit all the properties, methods, and resources that CodeIgniter makes available to you. Okay, I've created a simple function called index. Index will always be the default function within your class, and I'll show you how that works in a moment. For now, here's a simple echo hello world statement. Now going to the browser, if I type our file name into the first segment of the URI, you can see that we're now getting the hello world statement. In the model view controller approach, the first segment correlates to the class name you wish to invoke, and the second segment correlates to the function name within that class. I can accomplish the same thing on this page by typing index as the second segment and explicitly calling that function, but in the absence of a second segment, the index function is always called by default. While we're looking at the URL, I should also mention the index.php file can easily be removed with the .htaccess file, so if you'd like cleaner URLs, you can easily accomplish this. If I were to reload the page using only the front controller again, you'll see I'm still getting a 404 page, because even though we've made a controller, we haven't told CodeIgniter to show anything by default. There's no assumption made by CodeIgniter that a particular controller is what you want shown by default, but we can do that by going into the config folder and opening the routes file. This file lets us create mapping instructions for our URL, and among other things, allows us to specify a default controller. If I change this to blog, the controller we just created, and then reload the page, it's now serving that controller up as the default. Okay, I'd like to create a view file now. It's not really considered a good practice to send information to your web browser directly from your controller, so I'll create a corresponding view file to do that. I'll name this one blog view. Now, unlike controllers, which must be named identically to the class name, view files can be named whatever you want. I'm simply choosing this so that the correlation is clear for our tutorial, but you can name it with whatever type of abstraction you like. You can add further organization by creating subfolders within the views folder to give you a deeper structure if you want. For now, I'll just paste some simple HTML with a title and a page heading. Now that that's done, I'll go back to the controller and load the view file from the controller by replacing the echo statement with our view load function. You'll notice that the parameter I'm using is the same as the file name for the view file. You can use the file extension if you want, but it's not necessary. I can now go back to the browser and reload the page and see that my new view file is being served up from the controller. At this point, the view file is just a static web page, so I want to replace some of these static elements with dynamic ones. Going back to the controller, I'll create a data array containing some dynamic information that I'll pass to the view file. Now I can take this data array and place it as the second parameter in the view loading function and pass that information onto the view file. In doing this, the indexes of our array will also be converted to variables to make them easy to work with in our view files. So I'll go to the view file and I'll replace the static information with dynamic information with some simple PHP. Now if I save and reload the page in the browser, you can see that now our controller is dynamically passing the title and the heading to the view file. If your server supports PHP short tags, you can simplify this a bit. It allows us to replace our PHP echo statements with an equals sign, eliminate our semicolons, and use a simplified control structure. If you build your site with the help of a web designer, this can be beneficial because it reduces the amount of PHP code on the page, decreasing the potential for errors, and it makes the page appear a little cleaner too. Let's go back to the controller. At this point, all we've done is pass two simple strings to our view file. I'd like to send a different data type to the view file, so I'll create a new index called to-do, and I'd like to send an array to the view file. Okay, I've got an array with 3 elements assigned to an index called to-do. I'll go to the view file and create a control structure to display the information. I'll create an ordered list, and I'll use a for each loop to do this. And you'll notice I'm using the alternative PHP syntax using a colon instead of an opening brace, and likewise, instead of a closing brace, I'll use the end for each construct. Now I'll copy the item into the list element. So if I reload the page, you'll now see the to-do list. So I can pass arrays to the view files, multi-dimensional arrays, objects. It's really up to you to determine the data type you want to work with. One thing before I wrap up, I'm going to go back to the controller and create a constructor. In PHP 4, you'll recall that a constructor is simply a function that's named identically to the class. In PHP 5, there's a little different syntax. If you use a local constructor, you need to be aware that it will always override the constructor contained in the parent class. The side effect is that it will break your application. If I were to reload the page, you'll see that I now get an error message. In order to fix this, we need to explicitly call the constructor in the parent class. With that single line of code, I've reestablished that relationship, and I can reload the page and see that my application is working again. So remember that anytime you use a constructor, to explicitly call your parent controller class. That's it. That'll round out the introductory tutorial. We created a controller, made a view file, generated some dynamic information that we passed to the view file, and this should give you a glimpse at how easy CodeIgniter is to use. And if this is your first look at the model view controller approach, I think you'll see that it allows very nice separation between your application logic and your display elements. In later tutorials, we'll expand on this information. Thanks for watching.